fireside chat coming from Tala. Today we have the privilege of hosting Blake Brannon, who is the CTO at OneTrust, to participate with us. We're going to be spending the next half an hour to 40 minutes chatting about data privacy. So hopefully this is a topic that's of interest to you. It's obviously one of the hottest topics in technology in general today, and I'm very, very thrilled to have one of the experts when it comes to building privacy product and technology. So Blake, first of all, welcome to the fireside chat.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. So just a quick word on logistics here. As Mark mentioned, at any point, if you have any questions, raise your hand and we'll take your questions. This is meant to be an interactive session. We'll probably spend 30 to 40 minutes on our conversation and then have time for Q&A. Blake, I wanted to start with sort of a quick background about you. I'd love to know a little bit about your background, at least for the listeners, and particularly talk about what made you get into privacy. You could have gone into so many different areas in technology. What prompted you to join the privacy industry?
Yeah, that's a great question. So my story that got me to privacy actually started with the thing that actually has probably some of the most sensitive private information, about us, which is our phone. And I was part of a team that built a mobile security and management company called AirWatch. And what we focused on helping organizations do back in the 2008, 2009, 10, when iPhone and Android devices were all coming out. If you can remember the days where you used to have like a work BlackBerry and then you had your personal phone. And as time went on, like your personal phone it started to have the same capabilities and the power. And it was kind of like an obvious of like, why am I carrying two phones around? Why can't I just use this personal one and put my work information on it? And that kind of exploded this whole world of possibilities of, how do we get productivity gains and allow people to work from anywhere and, creating business apps and all these things, but it needed some technology to kind of separate work from personal. So we focused on building that. And in doing that and helping organizations deploy those devices, we just kind of completely stumbled upon all kinds of privacy problems and challenges, everything from employees thinking that corporate IT could read all their text messages and listen to their phone calls, see all their personal photos and data on the devices. None of these things were true because of many of the safeguards and kind of privacy by design framework that was built into the systems. But that perception sort of exposed us to just what does privacy mean? And we started to build technology into the software to help organizations have privacy by design settings to prevent, someone on the help desk that could unlock a phone or something from being able to see something as simple as, what applications you had installed on your device. Because if I can just look at what files you have on your phone, I can defer religion, political association. I can refer if you've got health conditions, if you have children or not, if you're cheating on your wife or not. So lots of things you could defer from just simple information. And that led us to seeing kind of this overarching wave of, man, the world's gotten out of control with all the kind of data that they have, how it's being shared into these communities, third parties that have access to it. And we really just saw the opportunity for kind of a whole platform to help organizations start to manage the governance of like, what do they need to be doing to be private, to have good privacy programs, to be trustworthy. And we kind of started a whole company and a little bit of a rebirth of a whole industry and helping do that. And that's what OneTrust focuses on today. So that's my journey of how I got here.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Before, thanks for sharing your background. When we decided to do this fireside chat and when we locked down this time, I kind of did a thought experiment. I reached out to some of my friends, who are, educated in the technology space, to just chat about, hey, what does privacy mean to you? And it's still very interesting how you get this kind of binary feedback. On the one hand, there are people who are very particular about privacy, who are very concerned about privacy. And then on the other hand, people are like, hey, I really don't care, because it seems to me that, even today, despite all of the pressure on privacy, there's still a gap in the understanding of what does it mean to both the consumers and to the entire nation to lose people's privacy. And I had to explain that, look, do you understand that data is probably the most valuable commodity today? It's not oil or gold. I mean, imagine if somebody came into your house, took your gold and auctioned it off or pawned it off and made money from it. Would you have that same, laissez-faire approach to that? And that's what's happening today. And I had to use that, and like people are like, oh, okay, that's interesting. So it's a very interesting space. I mean, for me personally, I feel like we're still in the first innings of privacy. What's remarkable though is how quickly the space is kind of exploded, right? We see obviously GDPR being one of the kind of beachheads of this, but also now we have CCPA, PDPA. Countries across the world have these regulations. From an enterprise perspective, we still read that a lot of enterprises are not even GDPR compliant. A fraction of them are, but a lot of them aren't. Like, obviously this is a very difficult problem, especially for a multinational company. How do you even go about navigating this landmine of different regulatory frameworks, evolving regulatory frameworks? You had CCPA, now you have another version of that CCPA that's in place. So what are you seeing enterprises doing and not doing so well?
Yeah, I think the first thing you spoke about there is not compliant. I think the first question you kind of have to start asking is, what does it mean to be compliant? And the guidelines really haven't quite, it takes time. You do have to realize that GDPR is regulation and law. And just like any law that goes into effect, whether it's around privacy or anything else in our lives, we often need kind of cases and rulings and sort of seeing how it plays out to see how the interpretation of the spirit of policy kind of gets translated into tactical. What do we do in this scenario as civilization? Like, was that the intent of the law and the regulation? But I think you're right that there still are a huge amount of organizations that have treated privacy and GDPR is this kind of, let's just see what happens, and this wave. And with the follow-up of CCPA, LGPD, PDPA in Thailand, India's privacy law, CPRA in California, 5 other states that have initiatives in the ballot, to be voted into regulation, probably a federal law here in the US in the next 3 or 4 years. Organizations that are not taking it serious and kind of hoping it'll be something that just kind of passes and we don't really have to do anything, I think are going to be caught in a harder spot than those that realize that this is not some one and done fad, like a Y2K incident where it just happened and we've all moved on and we're back to normal. It's a systemic change that's sort of disrupting the world, and it's not going away. It's fundamental to, I think, almost every society's, fundamental beliefs of human rights. And it's definitely something that we as a society increasingly, I don't know how many people all jokingly talk about the experience of, whatever I say all of a sudden shows up as a Facebook ad. And there's a little bit
all the time. Yeah,
there's a little bit of truth into all those things of like, we're starting to see the negative implications and some of the harm that can happen because of this, and people are starting to peel the onion back to realize that this is why this is here, and we do need to regulate and start to govern the use of this, and we need to hold as society the companies that orchestrate in our environment and our countries accountable for respecting our rights and respecting our privacy, because it can cause harm.
Yeah, I actually personally have experienced this all the time. We're talking about something, the next moment I see an ad for it. It couldn't be coincidence. It couldn't have been coincidence. The The other interesting angle here is, of course, that the technology that people are consuming in order to sort of make themselves GDPR and other compliant. There are two aspects. One is from a decision-making perspective, do you think the tipping point has been reached where companies recognize that, the cost of not being compliant is much more than the cost of actually implementing the controls required? Because it's going to take costs and resources and effort to get these processes in. Do you think that tipping point has been reached?
I don't think so. I don't think we've seen near an amount of enforcements and penalties to really justify that. I think you have, we're still a little bit too in the middle ground there. It's too gray of an area where it's not black and white as much. And, even the Facebook FTC fine, substantial, but then you can easily argue the billions and billions of dollars on top of that they made by doing that.
Yep.
So I don't think we're quite there yet from a pure, we need to do this for cost. I think some of the drivers that are actually starting to push conversations we have and are hearing from the market are more of like, not so much the fine being the bigger cost, but the reputational damage and the customer expectation of, what the company's doing. And you kind of can equate it to be on par with corporate sustainability, ethics in the supply chain, carbon footprint, all these types of things where people are actually starting to look at the companies they're buying from and they expect that. And I think data privacy and making sure, what you are buying and who you're, what services you're using, that they are respecting those rights and you're kind of ultimately not the product. Your point of like the gold example of, once I realize that this company is, using my information and they've monetized and made, however many thousands of dollars off of that a year for me, all of a sudden I have a kind of a different opinion about them. Violated.
Yeah, absolutely. I honestly think that the elections in the United States in particular have actually prompted people to take a much closer look at social media companies in particular and how they are, how they're regulating data flow within their networks, but also what kind of data they're collecting about you, what kind of ads they're serving. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting and in some ways disappointing that tipping point hasn't been reached, but I do feel there's a kind of a groundswell of activity that will get us there. From a technology perspective or product perspective, I built my career in products, in building products, and you did the same. Now you're building products that are not necessarily used by IT personnel, right? They're being used by legal teams, and I'm just curious from a product development perspective, how did you have to shift your thinking to deliver product at OneTrust compared to AirWatch and other tech companies, where you're dealing with IT practitioners who speak a different language per se?
Yeah, it definitely is a shift. It hits you in the gut a little bit of who is your persona of user and how do you design things and things you think are kind of, let's just change that and everybody's going to understand it. You have a different audience that you're dealing with for sure. So what's been interesting is, even for us, we started building software for the privacy practitioner. And I kind of jokingly equated, I say internally to the team, I'm like, look, if you've ever talked to a lawyer, they're still complaining about the Microsoft Office, ribbon changing from 1997 and how they still can't find the menus, that they want in Excel. So that's the kind of mindset of the people we're dealing with. So while you think that everyone's just going to know that you move this, from here to here on the page, it is a massive deal. You can't underestimate the amount of scrutiny you need to put into the thought process and the product design. But that's one thing. As we've seen this industry progress, and probably even what you guys do, in its essence, privacy solutions and software are a lot about just good governance of what you're doing. And that spans everything from like your systems, your apps, your people, your processes, like everything you're doing. And it's not that you can't process data. That's not what privacy means. it means that you are doing it appropriately and in the spirit of which it was given and all these types of things. So the construct has shifted where we now are finding ourselves building technology, even as OneTrust, that is more geared towards, IT professionals. And you're right, like everything from the sales cycle to the way the valuations are done to the types of functions and features that are expected are very, very different based. But it has started to force organizations to really start to work together in a way that they probably never had to do. If a simple example is 5 or 10 years ago, your privacy problems could be solved by your legal team updating a contract.
Right.
And that was the end of it. Today, it is a very, I'll call it semi-disruptive organization-wide initiative where I actually need to do what we say we do in contracts. And I need to put the good governance in place. I have to figure out what's on my website. I have to figure out who my third parties are. I've got to have all that stuff together, and I've got to integrate various processes across the organization to make that really work. And it requires privacy, IT, security, governance. Like everybody's got to, start working together.
And I think, from my experience, and I'm sure it's yours too, companies really struggle when it comes to doing something that's truly cross-functional, right? Like every team has its own way of doing things, and now you're kind of forcing them to come together, share information, share a process. I would imagine that companies who are struggling with compliance, quote unquote, per se, with, let's say, GDPR, a lot of it is because of this inability to figure out how to get cross-functional collaboration going, right? I mean, we have so many collaboration tools, but it doesn't still break the silos.
Yeah, at the end of the day, it's people, process, and tools, and they all three have to kind of come together. But you're right, it is a very difficult thing for organizations to get off the ground. And I think when we saw some of the early projects being done within GDPR, many organizations would hire consulting agencies, and they would come in and they would help with some of those process-related, people-related, organization-wide initiatives. But we did see because of the scope of the regulation, I would just say publicity that it got, these became board-driven initiatives. Gartner puts out some surveys and research every year about the top sort of trends and top initiatives of CEOs and businesses. And for the first time ever, one of the top 10 initiatives this year was risk management. And obviously the top one is, grow the bottom line. But most of the time, things like risk and compliance and privacy, they're so buried down in the stack. People don't really care, but it's become such a heightened thing that it's gotten that level of visibility in the organization. But that's important because it requires that level of sponsorship, to really everybody in a company to care and to get on board with doing something.
Yeah. From a technology perspective or a technology provider, solution provider perspective, we're seeing obviously a lot of companies, and Tala, we ourselves, we solve a certain piece of the privacy puzzle. What are the major technology pieces that are still missing? I mean, what do you think vendors should be focused on solving for companies and for enterprises to get that number from 25% compliance to 100%?
Yeah.
What do you think is the main hazard?
Where do I start? Across the spectrum, it's like there needs to be huge advancements in the way we think about identifying risks and the way that gets modeled. Today there's tons of risk management systems, but it becomes this very manual human process to kind of identify those. It becomes manual to determine which ones you should care about. And it's really hard. It's not like, the NIST cybersecurity standard says this is a high risk vulnerability. That to me is like science. It's kind of like, yeah, I agree. There's this highly exploitable problem and you need to patch it. And that makes it a high risk. When you start to think about processing of data being inappropriate because consent was implicitly given, and you're doing a data transfer across two countries that don't have adequacy. It's super subjective. It's like crazy subjective. And a lot of times organizations want to know what's everyone else doing. So some of the sharing of, benchmarking stats and machine learning that can kind of help take the context of those and figure out what have we consistently done? What's the industry doing to help us understand if we care or not care about that type of risk is one area. I also think just automation in general is a big struggle. Most organizations try to do these initiatives, but they're trying to do it through human kind of inputs of information. So most people just don't even know what data they have. If I was to go to any company in the world and say, do you have a good inventory of what data you even have and what you're processing? There's no company in the world can tell us that, with 100% accuracy. So the level of discoverability, classifying what you have, figuring out what risks are tied to it is kind of a massive problem in the industry.
Yeah. We obviously at Tala, we focus a lot on web data, and what we find is just companies just don't know what's on their web applications and websites. They have third parties have fourth parties and fifth parties, and I honestly cannot name more than a handful of companies that truly have a handle on this, and more than having a handle on having a process by which they can control who gets added. Is there a check before these things get added? So we find that the web is a little bit of a wild west when it comes to privacy, and that often is the primary source of data collection. What is your take on that? I mean, like it seems like companies should be looking at their websites a lot more closely,
100%.
trying to get better understanding.
Yeah, it is. I mean, you guys know it as well as anyone, and that's just with their websites.
Yeah.
We over the past, if you think about like the past decade, we as an industry, we're big data. How do we get more data, get more information, create these experiences? And now we're sort of seeing the counter side of that, where it's like we have no clue what we even have at this point. And when you think about, as a society, I think over the past, what's the stat, like 90% of the data that's ever been generated in the history of time was created in the past 2 years. We have, as organizations, we have no idea like what we even have. And it can go everything from our websites to these massive data lakes that we've invested in. We don't know the quality of the data. People start using it for purposes. We have no idea the accuracy. Then you start thinking about residency laws where citizens' data, are governed by the country they reside in. You're transferring that data into a data lake. You're doing who knows what with it. You've got consumer rights you have to comply to and allow someone to request being deleted or forgotten.
Yeah.
So all those types of things are, huge challenges. But pragmatically, the good news is pragmatically, you got to start somewhere. And things like your websites, your mobile applications, those are pretty tangible. And there's technologies like Tala, there's technologies like OneTrust that can, scan your site, scan your mobile app. We can help you at least identify what's there and start to get control over what vendors are we running on our site.
Yeah.
What data are they processing? And those are stepping stones to kind of better govern your program and your company.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? The other reason why I'm kind of intrigued by where this is headed is, on the one hand, a lot of people think about privacy as, if I'm an enterprise, I just need to make sure that my third parties, my vendors, whoever that I'm doing business with, they're not being aggressive in their data collection, and I have good contracts with them. On the other hand, there's the malicious actor angle, right? Which is kind of the security angle, which is what happened to British Airways or Ticketmaster, right? Yeah. They ended up with fines, not necessarily because they were sharing it with, Facebook or somebody like that, but they ended up getting disrupted. Their IT systems got hacked, and a malicious actor was collecting it. So it seems like at the end of the day, you couldn't and this is kind of maybe philosophical, you couldn't really solve the privacy equation until you figure out the security angle, right? It's like the Seinfeld joke, right? You can take a reservation, you cannot keep a reservation. If you collect the data but you don't know how to keep it within your enterprise from malicious actors, then you know what have you really solved? So I'm just curious you guys obviously have, your tagline is privacy, security, and governance. To me, it seems like security becomes an important part of this. And are you seeing CISOs and compliance officers start to have more conversations about these things? What is your perspective?
Yeah, I think you're starting to see, even go back to one of your original questions about the person that buys our software or kind of uses the software. 2 years ago, most of our purchases were made through the chief privacy officer, the data protection officer. And today that's started to shift quite a bit into the CIO, the CISO type of role, because operationally, you as a company kind of have that data stored somewhere in some system, and you're going to kind of govern and comply it, and you're going to do that as one operational process. So having these silos of privacy can't live in a silo. Like you can't have a privacy team that solves your privacy problems. So we have started to see huge synergy there with the participation and even the ownership of the technology tool, shifting from someone in the privacy department owning the budget or getting the budget to buy the GDPR fixer or the CCPA fixer, and then as that's realized that wait, this is not this one and done Y2K type project. This is the runtime and ongoing norm. Yeah. We got to fold this under the standard CISO, CIO, because it's part of, just to your point, like it's part of privacy, or excuse me, security. It's part of security. It's part of just general compliance that we need to do. We have to start, coupling in CCPA, CPRA requirements and use cases into it.
Yeah. Now shifting gears, I'm curious to get your perspective on COVID, right? Like there's a lot of governments across the world are, implementing or have implemented contact tracing and all kinds of technology to like I was reading yesterday that I think Amazon has a technology that will monitor employees to see if they're wearing a mask, if they're sitting 6 feet away from each other. I mean, it almost seems like COVID has put a monkey in the works, or a spanner in the works, or a monkey wrench in there about privacy, because it's almost like you have a very legitimate reason to now share very, very private information, even images of you that can be processed by maybe it's Amazon, maybe it's another third party that Amazon. So what do you think the impact of COVID is going to be to all of this? Because it's obviously a huge disruptor.
Well, there's tons of things it's impacting, and I think one surfaces up lots of concerns when COVID caused all this remote working, and you have beyond contact tracing type things, you have employee surveillance type of things where people are now, a little more heightened about is the corporate IT monitoring activity, and is it okay for the level of monitoring that they're doing for the context of why they need to be doing that. So there's been some heightened security, awareness on that. You also have a lot of kind of not specific to just pure privacy, but almost continuity of the business kind of surfacing, coming up due to COVID, obviously. But as people have had to move to remote workflows and various things like that, we've seen an increase in, what's our continuity governance plan, and how does that tie to just the program that we're running and how we can continue to maintain those goods and services. And then to your point on, whether it's contact tracing or facial things, we even saw earlier this year with the Black Lives Matters movements and some of those things, like law enforcement agencies dropping out of facial recognition, image profiling. I've done several calls with companies that are concerned about, everything from like notes taken in a police database where there could be inferred, religious bias or things like that, where if I'm responding to a call, in a neighborhood, and there's a note there about a mosque or something about the neighborhood, am I going in with really a clean head on the scenario I'm stepping into and going to make the right decisions? So all of these things are huge surfacing events of the importance of like how harmful privacy issues can be. To your point of I don't care. Most people that say they don't care about privacy think about it of like, yeah, if somebody wants my email address, they can have it. I don't really care. But they're not understanding all the depth that could come behind that for all these other things. And as a society, like, do we want surveillance cameras everywhere? Do we want CTV? And now that we can do facial recognition and I can see, that you travel from here to here to here and I can map your path out, there's, does that sort of cross the line? It's an interesting question.
Yeah, actually, personally, I think it was a year ago or whatever, I went to my Google history to see all the data that they had. And it was just absolutely like my jaw dropped when I saw that Google literally knew exactly what places I was in for the last 5 years, every single location. It was just like, wow, this is crazy scary. And of course, the companies now give you the opportunity to delete that data. But I would imagine that 0.0001% of consumers worldwide are doing anything about it. And same thing with Facebook. I mean, it's just incredible how they can make these connections between what you're doing here. And I almost, and this Facebook thing keeps coming up. Hey, I'm talking to somebody and I see an ad on Instagram, on Facebook, and Facebook will tell you that they are not collecting this data. But that is only half the story, because they could have third parties that they're contracting with who might be collecting it on their behalf, or collecting it and then sharing it. And before it gets to Facebook, maybe there are 10 different parties involved. So yeah, you can keep an arm's distance from that data collection, but at the end of the day, the data comes to you. So it's really interesting. I wanted to get your kind of take on the consumer view here. I mean, it's funny. You started the conversation with, remember the days of you had a BlackBerry phone and your company phone. I remember the days when I had an office and a home. Right. We no longer have that. What do you think? What do you think is happening in the consumer perspective? I personally feel that the political level of political activity, COVID, all of that has some ways been positive, but also negative from a privacy perspective. What do you think the consumer is? What do you think will help consumers get a better sense of this importance of privacy?
I think that different regions around the world have a different level of maturity about that from a consumer perspective of just kind of fundamental understanding the importance of it. And I always equate, if you think about if you're born in the US and you're raised to kind of understand the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, it's kind of like part of who we are. We feel like we're in, that's part of being a living, breathing human. The same way we would feel about the freedom of speech or the right to bear arms or whatever in the US, I think Europeans typically have that mindset in the same way around just fundamental rights of privacy. And they immediately, feel they're a little more ahead of the curve there with just understanding the concerns and how it could go south. And part of that's purely because of the history of, that's how World War II started and the way all of that kind of went down. But from a consumer standpoint, I think it's increasingly becoming more and more apparent to individuals through a combination of, even the companies that we use and purchase goods and services from. You look at something like an Apple, why Apple? Privacy. That's iPhone. That's like one of their commercial campaigns. If you hear Tim Cook speak, he says, if you're not paying for the product, you are the product.
Yeah.
As we start to understand more and more of what's behind the free web, we start to realize that we are paying for it in different ways, and that we are getting manipulated into buying products because of the psychology advancements that have happened in those things. And as everybody, I think, feels like, hey, I can put my guard up when I have the the used car salesman try to attack me at the shopping, center. But when I feel like I'm not able to process what's happening to me when I see that ad and I see the kind of games that are being played, that's where I think we just as a society we've got to evolve. We've got to evolve just like we were able to evolve to handle the call within the next 30 minutes and you get a blah blah blah. As a civilization, like we will evolve to understand what's happening there, and we'll be much more conscious of it, and we'll have higher expectations of that's just no longer tolerable, or we don't want you to do that, or I don't want you to do that to my children, or whatever.
Yeah.
So
it's a great philosophical point. I think that there's that kind of, hey, there's all this effort being done in the psychological analysis of all this data to figure out what does this person want? What does Blake want? What's the product that if I show to Blake right now, he's going to buy, right? There's that angle, but there's also the kind of the growing instant gratification where like the moment I click, the product comes to my doorstep. So it's almost like people are getting trained to be less and less patient. Like, if they want something, they get it instantly. If you want to watch a movie, you just, go to Netflix. If not, go to Amazon or some other. So it's very interesting. We're actually starting to get some questions. So I wanted to, maybe end our kind of conversation per se with, what do you see in 2021 from the provider space? Obviously, you guys are obviously one of the leading privacy platforms today. What should we be expecting in 2021 from the privacy solution space?
Yeah, I think going back to the point of what I feel like the industry has to do, it's more automation of how do I couple these things together? So discovering what's happening on my site changes, discovering what now is going into my data lake or my system, and just helping me automate the process of who should I be flagging things to? Do we need to update contracts now? Is it okay to process this data? Or do we have to go get consent to use it for this use case? Do we update the terms that are on our website? Like all these things that ultimately are super disjointed, disconnected in an organization together. That's kind of the ongoing evolution. And it's not just, it's not just privacy, it's privacy, security, governance, it's ethics. The average person doesn't know like what's the difference in privacy, security, and ethics. Like it's kind of all the same. It's around how do we ultimately continue to stay as an organization trustworthy to our customers, because we want them to buy our goods and services. We want them to buy more from us. And for them to do that, especially in the digital age and era, we're going to have them trust us to get us their data. And I think these solutions are going to push more and more towards what does it even mean to measure your trust as a company? But how do I start to have technology that helps me measure my trust, monitor it, react to changes that are happening in the market, and drive the program and use so that I kind of keep myself on the tracks?
Yeah, very cool. We've gotten a number of questions. So I'm going to start with the first one here. It's probably a question that, I think we've covered part of it, but maybe Blake, if you were to name the top three things, what are the most critical gaps companies should be addressing from a risk perspective when it comes to maintaining, consumer or customer privacy? What are some of the top three? I think you mentioned data discovery being a big gap. What are some of the other big gaps?
I think still, websites and mobile applications are a massive gap still for many organizations, and even companies that rely on advertising and things. They think they can be compliant and kind of fulfill the obligation by putting little notices on their site that sort of capture ad tech consent, but they're not fixing the fundamental kind of problem of, what are their vendors, who has access to what data, are they enabling the right controls to, not sell my information, and many mobile applications don't have this at all today in it, and TV applications definitely don't have it, even though we've seen a huge amount of websites have it. So I think that's a big blind spot. Even Zoom, I know we're on a Zoom call here. one of the simple scenarios here that is something that can happen to anyone is they took feedback from their customers. They're like, hey, how do we get people to join Zoom calls faster and, get connected? And they said, well, everybody's got Facebook accounts and they're all trying to join these from these groups. So let's plug the Facebook SDK into the Zoom meeting. And that was, some great engineer and product manager making a great decision based on customer feedback. But boom, all of a sudden they didn't realize that by putting it in by default, all this data is now going to Facebook and it's being used. And now they're in the Wall Street Journal.
Yeah.
The front page of the Wall Street Journal about all these privacy and security problems they have. So simple mistake, but it could happen to anyone. And that's the context of how these things kind of happen today. So that's a huge area for sure. The second one I would say, in addition to the discovery, is consumer rights automation and kind of, user preferences and choices. I think this, again, is something that is a big area that organizations need to just put some basics in place of, showcasing your program by saying, hey, we fulfill obligations of consumer rights, and we allow you to make these requests of like, hey, I'd like you to delete all my information, or I'd like you to share with me the information that you have about me. And those are just like simple tactical things that you can start doing to get your program going. And they keep you a little bit out of the Twitter mess of publicity, just because you look like you don't even care.
Yeah, it's a little bit scary how a very simple programming error or a simple product manager's decision error could have such, we have situations where companies, they want to collect a certain kind of information from their customers, and they end up creating pre-logger. And all of a sudden, boom, they have all of this data that they don't know what to do with, and now they have to be answerable for it. It's almost like there is no, historically, developers, engineering teams, product teams made decisions, marketing teams were making these decisions in isolation. But now it's almost like those decisions have to either be recorded or curated, or some level of checks and balances for that needs to happen. That's going to take a long time, and it's probably going to take technology that maybe doesn't exist in the form that it should be. I mean, that would be my honest take on it. I mean, what do you think? Because we're talking about so many different teams that are, we're talking about a developer that is, fighting for competing as sprint jobs, and they're making decisions day in and day out, and we don't know what decision is going to have that massive privacy impact. I mean, it seems like in some sense insurmountable, but that seems like there's an opportunity here.
Huge, yeah. I mean, like when you change your code and check it in, you should have privacy scanning, happening as part of that process to flag those things, and that should be integrated with your privacy team to kick off any kind of, hey, wait a minute, this could be happening here, and the same for your backend services, and not just on the mobile app side, but your backend services where you're storing your data, seeing that you've got these new fields of data that showed up in your data lake. You can't silo and bottleneck the business, because you're right, everybody kind of has to operate. Like marketing's got to run and do marketing things, but there does have to be some kind of pulling back a little bit. And I agree that not all the technology's there yet, but to start to detect and respond to those types of changes, and then put the appropriate, again, not telling everyone no, but just putting the appropriate safeguards. Like, do we need to amend our contract or our terms? Do we need to add something to our consumer rights automation process? But right now there's just lots of unknowns.
Got it. We're almost out of time here. I wanted to ask the audience if there are any additional questions. Post them. I feel like we've covered a lot of the questions that we're getting. Mark, let me know if there's any additional questions. Otherwise, look, I mean, I wanted to thank Blake for taking time and participating in this fireside chat. Hopefully this was useful. I mean, you're obviously a very deep thinker, and you've thought about these issues from multiple angles, and it's been a real pleasure to chat with you, Blake. Truly appreciate it. Is there anything you wanted to tell the listeners about, what you're going to be expecting to see from OneTrust, what they should be expecting to see from OneTrust before we close?
Yeah, I mean, one, thank you very much for the opportunity here. This was definitely a fun conversation, so I enjoyed it as well on our side. I think the exciting thing for us in this industry, one data point at the beginning of this year that was really surreal for us was we did a fundraise in February and valued our company at about 2.7 billion. And about a couple weeks later, I think Dell had announced that they were spinning off RSA, and they had valued the RSA at 2.1, billion. And not that that's like a pound our chest type of moment, but it was really more for the industry of solidifying like privacy is a new space, and it's a substantial space with that kind of a difference in valuation, and it's here to stay, and it's actually going to get more complex with more laws. The one thing I would say that is challenging but also a very interesting opportunity, privacy is driven from cultural expectations and through regulations. And I do not think that we will, as a world, agree on a standard the way we can agree on AES 256-bit encryption. Right. And just kind of say, let's go with that, and everybody's doing it. I think you're going to see more fragmentation. And as I said before, it's not just doing these things because there's a law that says I have to. We're starting to see that demand from consumers to really highlight, like, I don't want to do business with this company because I don't trust them. And the way you govern your data and the way you actually build a program and are aware of things like what's happening on our website, because we could have, an issue, whether it's privacy or security related from that, it's going to become a top level reason why people want to do business with you, just like they, 20 years ago did business with you because you were the known brand or you were the best value or, the best experience. It's going to be because of your corporate sustainability, your data privacy transformation, and ultimately how trustworthy of an organization you are.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Those are wonderful closing thoughts. And again, wanted to chat. Thank you for this chat. We will look forward to having you again back for another fireside chat, maybe sometime next year. But I wanted to wish you and your team a wonderful holiday season and successful 2021.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks everyone for joining today.
Thanks, Blake. Cheers.
Yep.
Bye.
Bye.